short story today. Old Henry Lawson classic. A story I think about a fair bit. Here we go. The ironbark chip. Dave Reagan and the party bush fencers, tank sinkers and rough carpenters were finishing the third and last culvert of their contract on the last section of the new railway line, and had already sent in their vouchers for the completed contract so that there might be no excuse for extra delay in connection with the cheque. Now it had been expressly stipulated in the plans and specifications that the timber for certain beams and girders was to be ironbark and no other, and government inspectors were authorised to order the removal from the ground of any timber or material they might deem inferior or not in accordance with the stipulations. The railway contractor's foreman and inspector of the subcontractors was a practical man and a bushman, but he had been a timber getter himself. His sympathies were bushy, and he was on winking terms with Dave Reagan. Besides, extended time was expiring and the contractors were in a hurry to complete the line. But the government inspector was a reserved man who poked around on his independent own and appeared in lonely spots at unexpected times with apparently no definite object in life, like a grey kangaroo bothered by a new fence, but unsuspicious of the presence of humans. He wore a grey suit, rode, or mostly led, an ashen grey horse. The grass was long and grey, so he was seldom spotted until he was well within the horizon and bearing leisurely down on a party of subcontractors, leading his horse. Now ironbark was scarce and distant on those ridges, and another timber, similar in appearance but much inferior in grain and standing quality, was plentiful and close at hand. Dave and party were about full of the job in place and wanted to get their cheque and be off to the next spec they had in view. So they came to reckon they'd get their last girder from a handy tree and have it squared in place and carefully and conscientiously tarred before the inspector happened along, if he did, but they didn't. They got it squared and ready to be lifted into its place. The kindly darkness of tar was ready to cover a fraud that took 4 strong men with crowbars and levers just to shift, and now, such is the regular cussedness of things, as the fraudulent piece of timber lay its last hour on the ground, looking and smelling, to their guilty imaginations, like anything but ironbark, they were aware of the government inspector drifting down of a casual Bill or Jim who happened to drop out of his easygoing track to see how they were getting on and borrow a match. They had more than half hoped that, as he had visited them pretty frequently during the progress of the work and knew how near it was to completion, he wouldn't bother coming anymore. But it's a way with the government. You might move heaven and earth in a vain endeavour to get the government to flutter an eyelash over something or the most momentous importance to yourself or your mates or the district or even the country. But just when you are leaving authority severely alone and have strong reasons for not wanting to worry or interrupt it and not desiring it to worry about you, it will take a fancy into its head to come along and bother. "It's always a way," muttered Dave to his mates. "I knew the beggar'd turn up. And the only cronk log we've had too," he added in an injured tone. "If this had been the only blessed ironbark in the whole contract, it would have been all right. Good day, sir," to the inspector. "It's hot." The inspector nodded. He was not an impulsive nature. He got down from his horse and looked at the girder in an abstracted way, and presently there came into his eyes a dreamy, far-away, sad sort of expression, as if there had been a very sad and painful occurrence in his family, way back in the past, and that piece of timber in some way reminded him of it and brought the old sorrow back home to him. He blinked 3 times and asked in a subdued tone, "Is that ironbark?" Jack Bentley, the fluent liar of the party, caught his breath with a jerk and cough to cover the gasp and gain time. "Ironbark? Of course it is. I thought you would know ironbark, mister." The mister was silent. "What else do you think it is?" The dreamy, abstracted expression was back. The inspector, by the way, didn't know much about timber, but he had a great deal of instinct and went by it when in doubt. "Look here, mister," put in Dave Reagan in a tone of innocent puzzlement with a blank bucolic face. "But don't the plans and specifications say ironbark? Ours does, anyway. I'll get the papers from the tent and show you if you like." Was not necessary. The inspector admitted the fact slowly. He stooped and with an absent air picked up a chip. He looked at it abstractly for a moment, blinked his 3-fold blink, then seeming to recollect an appointment, he woke up suddenly and asked briskly, "Did this chip come off the girder?" Blank silence. The inspector blinked 6 times, divided in 3s. Rapidly, mounted his horse, and said, "Day," and rode off. Reagan and the party stared at each other. "What did he do that for?" asked Andy Page, the third in the party. "Do what for, you fool?" inquired Dave. "Take that chip for?" "He's taking it to the office," snarled Jack Bentley. "What for? What does he want to do that for?" "To get it blanky well analysed, you ass. Now are you satisfied?" And Jack sat down hard on the timber, jerked out his pipe and said to Dave in a sharp toothache tone, "Give me a match." "What are we to do now?" inquired Andy, who was the hardest grafter, but altogether helpless, hopeless and useless in a crisis like this. "Grain and varnish the bloomin' culvert," snapped Bentley. But Dave's eyes, that had been ruefully following the inspector, suddenly dilated. The inspector had ridden a short distance along the line, dismounted, thrown the bridle over a post, laid the chip, which was too big to go in his own pocket, on top of it, got through the fence and was now walking back at an angle across the line in the direction of the fencing party, who had worked up on the other side, a little more than opposite the culvert. Dave took in the lay of the country at a glance and thought rapidly. "Give me an ironbark chip," he said suddenly. Bentley, who was quick-witted when the track was shown him, as is a kangaroo dog, Jack ran by sight, not scent, glanced in the line of Dave's eyes, jumped up and got a chip about the same size of that which the inspector had taken. Now the lay of the country sloped generally to the line from both sides, and the angle between the inspector's horse, the fencing party and the culvert was well within clear concave space. But a couple of 100 yards back from the line and parallel to it, on the side of which Dave's party worked their timber, a fringe of scrub ran within a few yards of a point which would be about in line with a single tree on the cleared slope, the horse and the fencing party. Dave took the ironbark chip, ran along the bed of the watercourse in the scrub, raced up the siding behind the bushes, got safely without breathing, across the exposed space and brought the tree into line between him and the inspector, who was talking to the fences. Then he began to work quickly down the slope towards the tree, which was a thin one, keeping it in line, his arms close to his sides and working, as it were, down the trunk of the tree as if the fencing party were kangaroos and Dave was trying to get a shot at them. The inspector by the by and had a habit now of glancing now and then in the direction of his horse, as though under the impression that it was a bit flighty and restless and inclined to bolt on opportunity. It was an anxious moment for all parties concerned, except the inspector. They didn't want him to be perturbed, and just as Dave reached the foot of the tree, the inspector finished what he had to say to the fences, turned and started to walk briskly back to his horse. There was a thunderstorm coming. Now, this was the critical moment. There were certain prearranged signals between Dave's party and the fences which might have interested the inspector, but none to meet a case like this. Jack Bentley gasped and started forward with an idea of intercepting the inspector and holding him for a few minutes in bogus conversation. Inspirations come to one at a critical moment, and it flashed on Jack's mind to send Andy instead. Andy looked as innocent and guileless as he was, but he was uncomfortable in the vicinity of funny business and must have an honest excuse. "Not that that mattered," commented Jack afterwards. "It would have taken the inspector 10 minutes to get at what Andy was driving at, whatever it was." "Run, Andy. Tell him there's a heavy thunderstorm coming and he'd better stay in our humpy till it's over. Run, don't stand standing like a blanky fool. He'll be gone." Andy started, but just then, as luck would have it, one of the fences started after the inspector, hailing him as, "Hi, mister." He wanted to be set right about the survey or something, or to pretend he wanted to be set right, from motives of policy, which I haven't time to explain here. That fencer explained afterwards to Dave's party that he had seen what you coves was up to, and that's why he called the inspector back. But he told them that after they had told their yarn, which was a mistake. "Come back, Andy," cried Jack Bentley. Dave Reagan slipped round the tree, down on his hands and knees, and made quick time through the grass, which, luckily, grew pretty tall on the 30 or 40 yards of slope between the tree and the horse. Close to the horse, a thought struck Dave that pulled him up and sent a shiver along his spine and a hungry feeling under it. The horse would break away and bolt, but the case was desperate. Dave ventured an interrogatory, "Coat, coat, coat." The horse turned its head wearily and regarded him with a mild eye, as if it expected him to come on all fours and wondered what he kept him so long. Then he went on blinking and thinking. Dave reached the foot of the post, the horse obligingly leaning over on the other leg. Dave reared head and shoulders cautiously between the posts like a snake. His hand went up twice, swiftly. The first time he grabbed the inspector's chip, and the second time he put the ironbark in its place. He drew down and back and scuttled off for the tree like a gigantic tailless goanna. A few minutes later, he walked up to the culvert from along the creek, smoking hard to settle his nerves. The sky seemed to darken suddenly. The first great drops of the thunderstorm came pelting down. The inspector hurried to his horse and cantered off along the line in the direction of the Fettlers' camp. He'd forgotten all about the chip and left it on top of the post. Dave Reagan sat down on the beam in the rain and swore comprehensively.